The hot sun beat down on the rocky ground of planet Kepler 442c as 27 young cadets stood in neat rows. Their different colored skins and strange body shapes made them look like a collection of alien toys. Some had 6 arms, others had crystal-like skin that sparkled in the sunlight, and a few floated in the air inside special suits filled with gas. Among all these strange beings stood one normal-looking young man. Jake Turner was 22 years old and looked just like any human you might see walking down the street back on Earth. His brown hair was cut short, his blue eyes looked calm, and his hands were already dirty from touching the ground to test the soil. He was the only human in the group, and everyone could tell he was different. Commander Vexilani towered over all the cadets like a giant made of living glass. His body was clear and sparkled with different colors when he moved. When he spoke, his voice sounded like music mixed with the sound of breaking crystal. He was the teacher for this final test at the Galactic Military Academy, and his job was to make sure only the best cadets passed. "Listen carefully," the commander said, his strange voice carrying across the empty land. "You have 3 days to build a shelter. In 3 days, a big storm will come. Your shelter must be strong enough to keep you safe from winds that can knock down trees and rain that falls like rocks. You can use any tools from your kit, but no one can help you. If your shelter fails, you fail the test." Jake looked around at his classmates. Most of them seemed excited and confident. They had been training for this test for months, and their species had been building things for thousands of years, longer than humans had even known about space travel. The arachnids could build with their 6 arms faster than any machine. The crystallines could grow buildings from the ground like plants. The Drachnari had technology that could bend reality itself, but Jake was not worried. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas, and his grandfather had taught him things that no school could teach. His grandfather had been a stubborn old man who refused to use modern tools. "Boy," he used to say, "machines break down, but your hands and your brain will always work if you know how to use them right." The commander continued talking. "Each team will have 3 members. You will work together, but each person must build their own shelter. The teams have already been chosen." He began reading names from a list, and Jake heard his name called with 2 others. Jake's teammates were Kethmor and Zilthara. Kethmor was an arachnid who looked like a giant spider that had learned to walk on 2 legs. His 6 arms moved constantly, and his big compound eyes reflected everything around him like mirrors. He was studying to be an engineer and was known for building things that looked impossible. Zilthara was a crystalline who looked like she was made of purple glass. Her people could actually grow buildings from crystals, shaping them with their minds and special tools. She was quiet and moved gracefully, but Jake could tell she thought humans were not very smart. The cadets were led to a large area where boxes of equipment waited for them. Each cadet got their own box filled with amazing tools that Jake had only heard about in stories. There were plasma cutters that could slice through metal like butter, molecular assemblers that could build things 1 atom at a time, and force field generators that could create walls out of pure energy. Jake picked up his box and immediately knew something was wrong. The box was too light. When he opened it, he found that all the power cells were completely dead. The backup generators were missing, and some of the tools looked like they had been broken on purpose. Someone had sabotaged his equipment. "Hey," called out Vashtik, a Drachnari whose scales were dark green with gold edges. He was the kind of person who always tried to make others feel small. "Human, do you even know what those tools are for? Maybe you should go back to your mud planet and play with sticks." Some of the other cadets laughed, but Jake just smiled and closed his box. He had dealt with bullies before, and he knew that getting angry would only make things worse. Besides, he had a feeling that Vashtik was the one who had broken his tools. The Drachnari had made it clear from the first day that he did not think humans belonged in the academy. Jake's teammates came over to see what was wrong. Kethmor's 6 arms moved quickly as he examined the broken equipment. "This is bad," he said, his voice making clicking sounds. "All your power cells are drained, and someone removed the backup systems. Without power, none of these tools will work." Zilthara's crystal body made a soft humming sound that meant she was thinking. You should tell the commander, this is against the rules. Someone cheated. Jake shook his head. The commander said no outside help. If I ask for new equipment, that counts as help. Besides, I think this might be part of the test. Maybe they want to see what we do when things go wrong. The truth was that Jake suspected this was not part of the test at all. He thought Voshtik had sabotaged his equipment to make him fail, but he also knew that complaining would not help. He had to find another way. What will you do? Asked Kethmer. You cannot build anything without tools? Even the most basic species need tools to make shelter. Jake looked around at the landscape. The ground was rocky in some places and softer in others. There was a small stream running through the area, and near the water, the soil looked different. He walked over to the stream and knelt down, digging his fingers into the earth. The soil was perfect. It had clay in it, which made it sticky when wet but hard when dry. There were also small stones and dead grass everywhere. Jake smiled as he remembered his grandfather's voice. The best building materials are the ones nature gives you for free. I will build with my hands, Jake said simply. The other cadets who had been watching started to laugh. Even some of Jake's teammates looked embarrassed. Building with bare hands seemed impossible to beings who had grown up with advanced technology. Voshtik laughed loudest of all. The primitive human thinks he can build with dirt and sticks. This will be entertaining. I cannot wait to see you fail. But Jake was not listening to the laughter anymore. He was looking at the stream and thinking about the many times he had helped his grandfather build things on the farm. They had built walls from stones without cement, roofs from wood they cut themselves, and even a small dam from mud and rocks. His grandfather had always said that humans were the best builders in the universe because they had learned to work with whatever they could find. The other cadets began walking away to start their own projects, but Jake stayed by the stream. He spent the rest of the first day just testing the soil and looking at the area around the water. He found the best clay, the strongest grass, and the right-sized stones. He also studied the wind patterns and watched how the water moved. By evening, while the other cadets were already building amazing structures with their high-tech tools, Jake had not built anything at all. He had only gathered materials and drawn plans in the dirt with a stick. To everyone watching, it looked like he was wasting time, but Jake knew better. His grandfather had taught him that the most important part of building was not the building itself, but the planning. Measure twice, cut once, the old man used to say, and always remember that the ground will tell you what it wants to support. As the alien sun set behind the strange hills, Jake lay down next to his pile of clay and grass. Tomorrow he would start building, and he would show these advanced aliens what a human could do with nothing but dirt, water, and 2 willing hands. The second day began with the sound of buzzing and humming as the alien cadets turned on their powerful machines. Jake woke up next to his pile of clay and grass, brushing dirt off his clothes as he watched the amazing technology come to life. Around him, Kethmer was already working with his molecular assembler, a machine that looked like a metal box with tubes coming out of it. The 6-armed arachnid moved his hands quickly over the controls, and the machine began making a strange singing sound. Slowly, pieces of metal and plastic began forming in the air above the machine, fitting together like puzzle pieces to create walls for his shelter. "Watch this, Jake," Kethmer called out, his compound eyes reflecting the morning sun. "The assembler can take basic materials and turn them into anything I design. I just tell it what I want, and it builds it atom by atom." Jake watched in wonder as a perfect wall appeared out of thin air. The wall was smooth and shiny with no joints or seams anywhere. It looked like it had been carved from a single piece of metal by a giant machine. In just 1 hour, Kethmer had created something that would have taken human workers weeks to build. "That is amazing," Jake said, and he meant it. The technology was incredible, even if he could not use it himself. Nearby, Zilthara was doing something even more impressive. She had placed her hands on the rocky ground and closed her eyes. Her crystal body began to glow with soft purple light, and the rocks beneath her hands started to change. They grew upward like plants, forming walls that sparkled and shined in the sunlight. My people have been growing crystal structures for 50,000 years, she explained without opening her eyes. We can feel the atomic structure of minerals and guide them to grow in the patterns we need. This shelter will be stronger than steel but lighter than wood. Jake knelt down and touched one of the crystal walls. It felt warm and smooth, and he could see light moving through it like slow lightning. The wall was beautiful and looked like it belonged in a palace rather than on this rocky planet, but the most impressive sight was happening across the field, where Vostok and his Draknari teammates were building something that looked like it came from a science fiction movie. They had set up 3 tall poles in a triangle and activated their force field generators. Suddenly, walls of pure energy appeared between the poles, shimmering like heat waves, but solid enough to stop anything. "Behold the power of true technology," Vostok announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "Force field walls that can stop a speeding spacecraft. They are completely adjustable and can be made stronger or weaker as needed. This is how advanced civilizations build, not like some primitive creature playing in the mud." He looked directly at Jake when he said this, and several other cadets laughed. Jake just nodded politely and went back to his pile of materials by the stream. The Merlani team was working in their own strange way. These fish-like beings floated in special suits filled with water and used tools that shot high-pressure streams of liquid. They were shaping the local rocks by blasting them with water that moved so fast it could cut through stone like a knife. "Hydropressure forming," explained their leader, a blue-scaled being named Equiline. "We use water as both a tool and a building material. The pressure can be controlled to carve, shape, or even weld materials together." Jake watched as they carved perfect blocks from the local stone and fitted them together without any cement or glue. The water pressure was so precise that the blocks fit together perfectly, creating walls that looked like they had been built by master craftsmen. The insect-like hive minds were working as a team in a way that made Jake's head spin. All 12 of them moved at exactly the same time, like they were parts of a single giant machine. Their biomechanical tools looked like they were alive, growing and changing shape as they worked. "We think as one mind," explained their speaker, a green creature with large black eyes. "Our tools are living things that we have bred for building. They know what we need before we ask for it." As Jake watched, their tools actually did seem to be alive. They stretched and bent like animals, and they worked together to create organic-looking structures that seemed to grow from the ground. The walls curved and flowed like frozen water, and they were covered in patterns that looked like tree bark or fish scales. Even the robotic beings were impressive. Dr. Synthex and his team were building with pure mathematics, using computers to design every part of their shelter before they built it. Their structure looked like it was made of geometric shapes that fit together in impossible ways. "Every angle has been calculated for maximum strength," Dr. Synthex explained in his mechanical voice. "Every joint has been tested in computer simulations. This shelter will survive forces that would destroy a mountain." Jake looked around at all these amazing technologies and felt a little overwhelmed. These beings had tools that could create matter from nothing, bend reality, and build with living creatures. What could he possibly do with just mud and grass? But then he remembered his grandfather's words. "Fancy tools are nice, boy, but they are only as good as the person using them. The best tool is the one you understand completely." Jake walked back to his materials and started working. He had spent the morning watching the others, but now it was time to begin his own project. He took off his boots and socks and stepped into the stream, feeling the cool water and soft mud between his toes. The first step was to mix the clay with water to make it the right consistency. Jake had learned this from his grandfather, who had learned it from his grandfather before him. The clay had to be wet enough to stick together, but not so wet that it would not hold its shape. Jake scooped up handfuls of clay and began mixing it with water from the stream. He added dried grass and small stones to make the mixture stronger. His hands moved quickly and smoothly, feeling the texture change as he worked. When the mixture felt right, he began forming it into bricks. Other cadets started to notice what Jake was doing. They stopped their work and came over to watch the human playing in the mud like a child. "What is he doing?" asked Nixara, a floating gas giant dweller whose team had just finished setting up their atmospheric processors. "Is this some kind of human ritual?" "He appears to be mixing organic materials with mineral deposits," observed Dr. Synfex, his electronic eyes scanning Jake's work. "The process appears to be entirely manual, with no mechanical assistance whatsoever." More cadets gathered to watch. Some of them seemed curious, others looked confused, and a few seemed to think Jake was crazy. But Jake ignored them all and kept working. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with doubt was to prove it wrong. Voshtik pushed through the crowd, his scales shining with amusement. "Look at the primitive human," he announced. "He thinks he can build something with mud and sticks. This is pathetic. Even the most backward species in the galaxy use tools." "Actually," said Kethmore quietly, "this is quite interesting. The human is creating a composite material by combining different substances. It is primitive, but it is still engineering." Jake looked up from his work and smiled. "My grandfather used to say that the best engineers are the ones who can build something from nothing. He built a house that stood for 80 years using nothing but materials he found on his own land." "Your grandfather was a fool," Voshtik sneered. "Modern materials are stronger, lighter, and more durable than anything your species could create with primitive methods." Jake nodded politely. "You might be right, but we will find out in 2 days, won't we?" As the day went on, the alien shelters began to take shape. They were magnificent structures that looked like they belonged in a museum of future technology. Force field walls hummed with energy, crystal growths sparkled like jewels, and biomechanical constructs moved and breathed like living things, but Jake's work looked like something from the distant past. He had made dozens of mud bricks and was laying them in rows to form walls. His hands were covered in clay, his clothes were dirty, and he was sweating from the hard work. To anyone watching, he looked like he was building the most primitive shelter ever constructed. By evening, the other cadets had made amazing progress. Some of their shelters were already complete, while others were well on their way to being finished. Jake's shelter was still just a low wall of mud bricks that barely reached his knees. As the sun set, Jake sat next to his small wall and ate his dinner. Around him, the other cadets were relaxing inside their climate-controlled shelters, protected from the night air by advanced technology. Jake slept outside under the stars, using his jacket as a blanket, but he was not discouraged. His grandfather had taught him that the most important part of building was not speed, but patience. "Good things take time, boy," the old man used to say. "Rush the job and you will have to do it twice." Tomorrow would be the final day before the storm arrived. Jake had a lot of work to do, but he was confident that his simple mud shelter would be ready. After all, humans had been building with Earth for thousands of years, and they had learned a few tricks along the way. The third day started with a strange sound that made everyone look up at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind was getting stronger. The storm was coming early, and it looked bigger than anyone had expected. Jake woke up feeling stiff and cold. He had slept on the ground next to his half-built shelter, and his body ached from the hard work of the day before. But when he looked at his mud walls, he smiled. They had dried overnight and were now hard as stone around him. The other cadets were making final adjustments to their high-tech shelters. The air was filled with the sounds of machines humming, energy crackling, and tools buzzing. Everyone was working faster now because the storm clouds looked scary. Jake stretched his sore muscles and got back to work. He had built his walls up to about 4 feet high, but they were still not finished. He needed to add more layers and build a roof before the storm arrived. His hands were already raw from working with the rough clay, but he ignored the pain and kept going. The first person to notice something different about Jake's work was Aquelin, the Merlani who worked with water pressure. She floated over in her water suit and studied the mud walls with her large fish eyes. "Human," she said in her gurgling voice, "your walls look very thick." Why do you make them so heavy when you could make them thin and light? Jake continued working as he answered. Thick walls store heat during the day and keep the inside cool. At night, they release the heat and keep the inside warm. My grandfather called it thermal mass. But thick walls are harder to build and use more materials, Equilin pointed out. True, Jake agreed, but they also last longer and need less maintenance. Sometimes it is better to work harder at the beginning so you can rest later. More cadets began to gather around Jake's construction site. His shelter was starting to look very different from all the others. While their shelters were tall and straight with sharp angles, Jake's shelter was low and curved. The walls were thick and smooth, and the whole thing looked like it was growing out of the ground. Dr. Synthex rolled over on his mechanical wheels, his electronic eyes scanning every inch of Jake's work. Fascinating, he said in his robot voice. The human is creating a structure with no right angles. The walls curve upward and inward. This is highly unusual. It is called a dome, Jake explained, wiping sweat from his forehead. The curved shape makes it stronger than straight walls. When the wind hits it, the air flows around it instead of pushing against it. But how do you calculate the proper curve without computers? Asked Dr. Sen's single quotes Thex. Jake smiled and held up his hands. My grandfather taught me to feel the right shape. You start with a circle on the ground, then curve the walls up like you are making a bowl upside down. The clay will tell you when the curve is right. Vostok had been listening to this conversation, and his scales turned dark with annoyance. The human is making excuses for his primitive methods, he announced loudly. Random curves based on? Feelings cannot be stronger than precise angles calculated by computers. We will see, Jake said calmly, not looking up from his work. By midday, Jake's shelter was really taking shape. He had built the walls up in a dome shape, and now he was working on the most difficult part, closing the top. This required careful planning because each layer had to be smaller than the one below it, and the clay had to be just the right consistency to hold its shape. Kethmer came over to watch, his 6 arms moving nervously as he saw the storm clouds getting closer. Jake, how do you know the top will not fall down? You have no supports holding it up, Jake pointed to the curved walls. Each brick supports the ones next to it. The curve spreads the weight evenly around the whole structure. It is like making a bridge that goes in a circle. But what if you make a mistake? What if one brick is not right? Then I fix it, Jake said simply. Clay is forgiving. If something goes wrong, I can add more clay or reshape what I have already built. This was very different from how the other cadets were working. Their machines either worked perfectly or they did not work at all. If something went wrong with their technology, they had to start over or call for help. But Jake could adjust his shelter as he built it, making changes whenever he needed to. As the afternoon went on, more problems started appearing with the high-tech shelters. The wind was getting stronger, and it was affecting some of the machines. Vostok's force field generators were starting to flicker because the changing air pressure was interfering with their energy fields. The atmospheric disturbance is stronger than predicted, Vostok growled, his scales turning pale with worry. My generators are not designed for this level of interference. Zilthara was having problems too. Her crystal walls were beautiful, but they were starting to vibrate in the wind. The sound was like a giant musical instrument, and it was getting louder as the wind got stronger. The resonance frequency is matching the wind patterns, she said, her crystal voice sounding worried. If this continues, the vibrations could shatter the entire structure. Even Kethmer was running into trouble. His molecular assembler was having difficulty working in the changing atmospheric conditions. The machine kept stopping and starting, and some of the materials it created were not fitting together properly. The air composition is changing too quickly, he explained to Jake. My assembler needs stable conditions to work correctly. Jake looked around at all the struggling high-tech equipment and felt a strange sense of relief. His simple mud shelter was not affected by air pressure or atmospheric interference. Clay and grass did not care about electromagnetic fields or resonance frequencies. They just sat there and did their job. Commander Vexilani made his first inspection of the day, walking from shelter to shelter and checking on each cadet's progress. When he reached Jake's dome, he stopped and studied it for a long time. "Cadet Turner," the commander said, his crystal voice filled with curiosity, "explain your construction method." Jake wiped his muddy hands on his pants and stood up straight. "Sir, I am using traditional earth construction techniques. The clay content in the local soil is about 30%, which is ideal for this type of building. I mixed it with organic fibers from the local grass to add tensile strength and small stones for structural stability." "And you calculated these proportions how?" "I did not calculate them, sir. I tested them. I made small samples with different mixtures and tested them by hand until I found the combination that felt right." Commander Vexillania's crystalline features showed what might have been surprise. "You determined the optimal material composition through tactile evaluation?" "Yes, sir. My grandfather taught me that your hands can tell you things that machines cannot. Clay has been used for building for thousands of years on my planet. We have learned what works and what does not work." The commander walked around the dome, examining the thick walls and smooth curves. "And the structural design? How did you determine the optimal dome configuration?" "Trial and error, sir. Humans have been building domes for a very long time. We have learned that certain shapes work better than others. This shape has been tested by many storms over many years." "Fascinating," the commander murmured. "You are using accumulated knowledge from your species rather than individual calculation," Jake nodded. "Yes, sir. When you cannot rely on machines, you have to rely on experience. And when you do not have your own experience, you have to rely on the experience of those who came before you." By late afternoon, Jake's dome was nearly complete. He had closed the top and was now working on the final details. He made a small door by leaving a gap in the wall, and he created a smoke hole at the top to let air flow through the shelter. The other cadets were watching him work with growing interest. Some of them had never seen anything built without machines, and they were amazed by how Jake's hands seemed to know exactly what to do. "It looks so simple," said Nixara, her gas-filled suit bobbing in the wind. "Just mud and grass, but it is becoming a real building." "Simple does not mean easy," Jake replied, smoothing the last section of wall. "It takes practice to make it look simple." As the sun began to set, Jake stepped back and looked at his finished shelter. It was not beautiful like the crystal structures, and it was not impressive like the force field walls, but it was solid and strong, and it looked like it belonged on this planet. The storm was coming fast now. Lightning flickered in the dark clouds, and the wind was strong enough to blow dust and small rocks around. All the cadets were making final preparations for the night that would test everything they had built. Jake gathered his few belongings and crawled through the small door into his dome. Inside, the thick walls blocked out most of the noise from outside. The curved ceiling felt solid above his head, and the air inside was still and comfortable. As he settled down for the night, Jake could hear the other cadets outside, still working on their shelters and worrying about the storm. But inside his simple mud dome, he felt safe and ready. His grandfather had always said that the best shelter was one that made you feel at home, and that was exactly how Jake felt tomorrow would bring the real test. But tonight, Jake Turner slept peacefully in his house of mud and dreams. Jake woke up to the sound of screaming wind and crashing thunder. The storm had arrived in the middle of the night, and it was much worse than anyone had expected. Through the thick walls of his mud dome, he could hear the terrifying sounds of the alien planet's fury unleashing itself on the testing ground. Outside, emergency alarms were going off. The weather monitoring systems were sending out warnings that made Jake's blood run cold. The storm was not just Category 4 anymore. It had grown into something much more dangerous, with winds strong enough to lift vehicles in rain that fell like bullets from the sky. Jake sat up in his shelter and listened carefully. Inside his dome, the noise was muffled, but he could still hear what was happening outside. There were sounds of metal tearing, energy fields crackling and failing, and voices shouting in panic. The high-tech shelters were in trouble. The thick mud walls around Jake absorbed most of the vibrations from the wind. When powerful gusts hit his dome, the curved shape made the air flow around it like water flowing around a rock in a stream. The whole structure swayed slightly, but it felt solid and safe. Jake crawled to his small door and looked outside. What he saw made his heart race with fear and amazement. The world had turned into chaos. Rain fell sideways in the fierce wind, and lightning lit up the sky every few seconds. The other shelters were fighting for their lives against nature's power. Vostok's force field shelter was failing badly. The energy walls flickered on and off like broken lights. Every time the wind changed direction, the field sparked and weakened. Jake could see Vostok inside, frantically working on his control panel, but the electromagnetic interference from the storm was too strong. "Emergency power failing!" Vostok shouted into his communicator, his proud voice now filled with panic. "The fields cannot hold much longer. The atmospheric pressure is beyond our design limits." As Jake watched, one of the force field walls completely disappeared. Wind and rain immediately rushed into the shelter, soaking everything inside. Vostok tried to restart the field, but his equipment was getting wet and sparking dangerously. Zilthara's crystal shelter was having a different kind of problem. The beautiful purple walls were shaking violently in the wind. The crystals were resonating with the storm's frequency, creating a horrible screaming sound that hurt to hear. The vibrations were getting stronger and stronger. The harmonic resonance is increasing, Zilthara called out to anyone who could hear her. The crystal matrix cannot dampen these oscillations. Structural failure is imminent. Jake watched in horror as cracks began appearing in the crystal walls. The beautiful structure that had taken so much skill to grow was being torn apart by its own vibrations. The crystals were singing themselves to death. Kethmer's technological marvel was also in serious trouble. His molecular assembler had stopped working completely when water got into its delicate machinery. Without the machine to hold them together, the perfectly fitted pieces of his shelter were starting to come apart in the wind. "The molecular bonds are breaking down," Kethmer shouted, using all 6 of his arms to try to hold pieces of his shelter together. Without the assembler's maintenance field, the structure has no integral stability. One by one, the advanced shelters were failing. The Merlani team's hydro-pressure structure was being washed away by the rain. The hive mind's biomechanical shelter was collapsing as their living tools went into survival mode and stopped working. Even Dr. Synthex's mathematically perfect structure was buckling under forces that his computers had not predicted. The storm grew worse as the night went on. Jake had never experienced anything like it. The wind howled like a living monster, and the rain hit his dome like millions of tiny hammers. Lightning struck the ground so often that the night sky looked like day, and thunder shook the earth constantly. But inside his simple mud dome, Jake was safe and comfortable. The thick walls kept out the noise, the wind, and the rain. The curved shape spread the forces evenly around the structure, so no single point had to bear too much stress. The thermal mass of the clay walls kept the inside temperature steady. Even as the outside world froze and burned with each lightning strike, Jake could hear emergency beacons activating all around him. These were automatic distress signals that went off when a cadet was in real danger. The high-tech shelters that had looked so impressive just hours before were now death traps, and their builders were calling for help. Through his small door, Jake could see rescue lights moving in the storm. Emergency teams were already responding to the crisis using special vehicles that could operate in extreme weather. They were pulling cadets out of collapsed shelters and taking them to the safety of the main base. "This is impossible," Jake heard Vostok screaming over the storm as rescue workers helped him from his ruined shelter. "My technology was supposed to be perfect. How can primitive mud withstand what advanced force fields cannot?" Jake felt sorry for Vostok, even though the Drakmari had been cruel to him. It was hard to watch someone's confidence get destroyed along with their shelter. But Jake also felt proud of his grandfather's teachings. The old man had been right about the power of simple, tested methods. The worst part of the storm hit around midnight. The wind became so strong that it picked up rocks and threw them through the air like bullets. The sound was terrifying, like the planet itself was screaming in pain. Lightning struck the ground every few seconds, and the thunder was so loud it made Jake's teeth hurt, but his mud dome stood firm. When rocks hit the thick walls, they simply bounced off or stuck in the clay. The curved shape made the wind slide over the shelter instead of pushing against it. The whole structure moved slightly with the strongest gusts, bending like a tree in the wind, but it never broke. Jake tried to sleep, but the noise outside was too frightening. Instead, he sat in the center of his dome and thought about his grandfather. The old man had lived through many storms on the farm in Kansas, and he had always said that the key to surviving bad weather was to stay calm and trust in solid construction. A house is only as good as its foundation, his grandfather used to say. Build it right from the bottom up, and it will take care of you when times get tough. Around 3 in the morning, Jake heard a new sound outside. Someone was calling his name through the storm. He crawled to his door and looked out to see Kethmer struggling through the wind and rain. The arachnid's shelter had completely collapsed, and he was soaked and shivering. "Jake," Kethmer shouted over the storm, "my shelter is gone. Can I come inside yours?" Jake immediately opened his door wider. "Of course, come in quickly." Kethmer crawled through the small opening, and Jake helped him get inside. The arachnid was amazed by what he found. The inside of the dome was quiet, dry, and comfortable. After the chaos outside, it felt like stepping into a peaceful cave. "This is incredible," Kethmer said, water dripping from his 6 arms. "I can barely hear the storm. How is this possible?" Jake handed him a spare shirt to dry off with. "Thick walls absorb sound and vibration. The shape deflects wind. And clay is naturally water-resistant when it is built correctly." More voices outside called for help. Jake looked out and saw Zilthara struggling with the remains of her crystal shelter. Her beautiful purple walls had completely shattered, and she was trying to protect herself from flying debris with her arms. "Zilthara," Jake shouted, "over here, you can shelter with us." The crystalline being looked surprised, then grateful. She ran through the storm and dove through Jake's doorway just as a particularly strong gust tried to knock her down. Like Kethmer, she was amazed by the calm inside the mud dome. "Your primitive shelter is more advanced than anything we built," she admitted, her crystal voice filled with wonder and shame. Soon, other cadets were asking for shelter. Jake's dome was not very big, but it could hold several people if they squeezed together. By dawn, 6 cadets were huddled inside the mud shelter that everyone had laughed at just 2 days before. Outside, the storm continued to rage, destroying everything that advanced technology had built. But inside a simple dome made of mud, grass, and ancient human knowledge, a group of alien cadets learned that sometimes the oldest solutions are the best solutions. As the first light of morning broke through the storm clouds, Jake looked around at his new friends and smiled. His grandfather would have been proud. When the storm finally ended, the morning sun revealed a scene of complete destruction. The testing ground looked like a battlefield where technology had fought nature and lost badly. Pieces of broken machines, shattered crystals, and twisted metal were scattered everywhere across the rocky landscape. Jake crawled out of his mud dome and stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. Behind him, the 6 alien cadets who had sheltered in his dome also emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight. They looked around at the devastation with shock and disbelief. Where magnificent high-tech shelters had stood just hours before, now there was only rubble and debris. Force field generators lay broken and smoking. Crystal walls had turned into piles of purple glass. Biomechanical structures had died and were already starting to decay in the morning heat. But in the center of all this destruction stood Jake's simple mud dome, looking exactly the same as it had before the storm. The thick clay walls were unmarked. The curved roof was perfect, and not even a single crack showed anywhere on the surface. Emergency rescue teams were already working across the field, helping injured cadets and cleaning up the dangerous debris. Medical units treated cuts from flying glass, burns from electrical failures, and shock from the terrifying night. Hover vehicles carried the most seriously hurt cadets to the medical center at the base. "Commander," Vexilani walked slowly across. The testing ground, his crystal body reflecting the morning light as he surveyed the damage. His face showed a mixture of amazement and concern. In all his years of teaching, he had never seen such complete failure of advanced technology. When the commander reached Jake's dome, he stopped and stared at it for a long time. He walked around the structure twice, examining every inch of the walls and roof. He ran his crystal fingers over the smooth clay surface, testing its hardness and checking for any damage. "Cadet Turner," the commander said finally, his voice filled with respect and curiosity, "your shelter appears to be completely undamaged. How do you explain this remarkable success?" Jake looked around at the destruction, then back at his simple dome. "I cannot explain it better than my grandfather did, sir. He always said that nature is the best teacher. If you want to build something that lasts, you have to learn from the things that have already lasted." "Please elaborate on this philosophy," Commander Vexilani requested. Jake thought carefully about how to explain what his grandfather had taught him. "Humans have been building with Earth for thousands of years, sir. We tried many different ways, and the methods that did not work were forgotten. Only the methods that worked again and again were passed down from father to son, mother to daughter. This dome design has survived countless storms over many generations." Voshtik approached them, his scales pale and his proud bearing gone. His expensive equipment was completely destroyed, and he had spent the night in the medical center being treated for electrical burns. But his physical injuries were nothing compared to the damage to his pride. "Human," Voshtik said quietly, his voice very different from the arrogant tone he had used before. "I owe you an apology. I called your methods primitive and stupid. I was wrong. Your shelter saved not only your life, but the lives of my fellow cadets as well." Jake looked at the humbled Draknari with kindness. "You do not need to apologize, Voshtik. Your technology is amazing. It can do things that my mud and grass never could. But every tool has its place, and sometimes the simple tools work better." Kethmore scuttled over on his 6 legs, his compound eyes reflecting gratitude. "Jake, I've been thinking about what happened last night. My molecular assembler could create perfect materials, but when it stopped working, everything fell apart. Your clay and grass are not perfect, but they do not need machines to hold them together." "That is exactly right," Jake said with a smile. "My grandfather called it appropriate technology. Use the most complex tool that you can afford to lose. In a storm like that, I could not afford to lose my shelter, so I used the simplest method I knew." Dr. Synthex rolled over on his mechanical wheels, his electronic brain still processing what had happened. "Fascinating data," the robot said. "My calculations predicted that primitive Earth construction would fail under Category 4 storm conditions. Yet your shelter withstood Category 6 conditions with no damage. My mathematical models were clearly incomplete." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Math is very important, Dr. Synthex, but it can only work with the information you give it. Humans learned about building through trial and error over thousands of years. That experience is not easy to put into equations." More cadets gathered around to listen to the conversation. Many of them had been rescued from their failed shelters during the night, and they looked at Jake's dome with new respect and wonder. Zilthara, her crystal body showing stress fractures from the night's ordeal, spoke in a voice filled with humility. "On my world, we have always believed that newer technology is better technology. We spent 50,000 years perfecting our crystal growing techniques, but we never tested them against truly extreme conditions." "Testing is important, Jake." "Agreed. But the best testing happens over many years in many different situations. My people tested Earth construction in every kind of weather, in wars, earthquakes, floods, and fires. The methods that survived all those tests are the ones I learned." Equilin floated over in her water suit, which was cracked from flying debris. "Human Jake, your people sound very wise. They learned from their mistakes instead of just making their tools more complex." Jake smiled at the fish-like being. "We made plenty of mistakes, Equilin, but we learned from them. My grandfather always said that the most expensive mistake is the one you have to make twice." Commander Vexilani had been listening to all of this with great interest. As an educator, he understood that he had witnessed something very important. "Class," he announced, his crystal voice carrying across the field, "gather around. Today you have learned something that cannot be taught in any classroom." The surviving cadets formed a circle around Jake's dome. Some were bandaged from injuries. Others showed the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but all of them were paying careful attention. "Observe this structure," the commander continued, gesturing toward the mud dome. It was built without advanced materials, without computer calculations, and without sophisticated tools. Yet it was the only shelter to survive the storm completely intact. Can anyone explain why? Several cadets raised their hands or appendages. Dr. Synthex spoke first. The human used accumulated knowledge rather than theoretical projections. His design was based on empirical evidence gathered over many generations. "Correct," the commander said. "What else?" Kethmore waved two of his arms. He chose materials that were simple and reliable instead of complex and fragile. When the advanced systems failed, his basic materials continued to function. "Also correct." "Any other observations?" Zothara's crystal voice was thoughtful. He understood the environment and worked with it instead of trying to dominate it. His dome shape used the wind's force instead of fighting against it. Commander Vexilani nodded approvingly. "Excellent insights. Now, what does this teach us about the relationship between technological advancement and practical effectiveness?" Vashtek, still humbled by his experience, answered carefully. "That the most advanced solution is not always the most effective solution. Sometimes wisdom is more valuable than sophistication." "Precisely," the commander said. "The galaxy has spent millennia developing incredible technologies. But in our pursuit of advancement, we sometimes forget the fundamental principles that make things work." Cadet Turner succeeded because he remembered those principles. Jake felt uncomfortable being the center of so much attention. "Commander." "Sir, I do not want anyone to think that human methods are better than alien methods. Every species has valuable knowledge. I just used what worked for my situation." "That is exactly the point, Cadet Turner," the commander replied. "True wisdom lies in knowing which tool to use for which job. Your people developed Earth construction because it was appropriate for your planet and your resources. Other species developed different solutions for their different challenges." The commander paused and looked around at all the cadets. But what makes this lesson truly valuable is that Cadet Turner was willing to share his knowledge and his shelter with others when they needed help. Technology means nothing without compassion. Nixara, floating in her damaged gas suit, spoke up. "The human could have stayed safe in his dome and watched us suffer. Instead, he opened his door to anyone who needed help. That is the most important lesson of all," Commander Vexilani said. "The greatest advancement any species can achieve is learning to work together and help each other." As the day went on, rescue teams finished cleaning up the debris and helping the injured cadets. Final grades were calculated and posted on the electronic boards. When the results appeared, many cadets were surprised, but no one was shocked. Jake Turner had received the highest marks in the survival course. His grade was perfect, not just for building a successful shelter, but for demonstrating leadership, adaptability, and compassion under extreme conditions. But more importantly, Jake had earned something that could not be measured or graded. He had earned the respect and friendship of cadets from across the galaxy.